So without further ado, welcome and thank you so much. My name is Dr. Megan Kirby, and I am the Director of Dissemination and Implementation Programs for Language Dynamics Group. And the title of this webinar this month, it's one of our free webinars that we hold every month, is all about the sciences of reading and writing and how to use story champs in implementing those aspects of language and literacy. Just a brief introduction or overview of sciences of reading. I can put writing in there. There's a lot more that goes into it, and you'll see I have to kind of shorten a little bit due to our 1 hour limitation here. If you're ever interested in having us come and speak, myself or any of the other scientists that are part of Language Dynamics Group, you can reach out, and we have a whole 6-hour training and professional development that we do for district schools and states, conferences, etc. So you can reach out. But this is 1 hour, so we're going to try to fit as much as possible in there so that you leave here understanding some of what Story Champs can do for you in addressing language and early literacy skills. So general understanding is that literacy begins to develop as soon as our brain begins to develop. Right? So in utero, we know that research has shown the phonological processing system starts to develop. That is before you're out of the womb, right? So we want to make best with the tools that we have. And one of those important things in the development of literacy skills and later on reading and writing is early language nutrition. And so scientists from the fields of education, communication sciences, developmental psychology, cognitive and behavioral learning, and neuroscience, we've all gotten together and we all have different threads or strands of research, but they all come together and align with what we now want to call the sciences of reading. It's not a silo. This isn't owned by any one particular profession or scientific domain. It's all hands on deck to help all of our learners who are struggling with language and literacy skills. What we now know is that if you are unable to read proficiently, we'll leave writing aside, but read proficiently, meaning word level reading skills, as well as comprehend what it is you just read, by 4th grade, you're less likely to graduate with a high school or terminal diploma. You're less likely to be employed in a job where there's opportunities for vocational advancement, right? So where you can have increases in pay over time. So you're more likely to be in lower income or low wage jobs, high turnover, lots of stress, and then that has epidemiological factors than your own family and your own children and illiteracy. There are signs or correlations with that being tied to dyslexia, which is a genetic or marked with genetic factors, right? So there's many different models for how reading works. And the simple view of reading came first. And then since then, this is Scarborough. The reading rope was a model that was from 2001 and really helped lay out what goes into true reading or reading comprehension. We're calling it skilled reading, right? The fluent execution and coordination of word recognition and language comprehension. So there's 2 major strands that we're going to take a look at. There's only 2 in the reading rope that we're going to take a look at. And the first being probably what's the most commonly found emphasis in professional development and early literacy and reading and teacher education and prep, in assessments and in curricula. If you know anything about letters training, there's an example. There's a huge emphasis on word recognition, right? So I'm going to point out that we do have an assessment. It's called the cubed 3. Think of language and literacy being assessed to the 3rd power, right? Like to be measured. So the cubed 3rd edition comes along, and it's a suite of universal screening and progress assessments. So it's benchmarking and progress monitoring for preschool all the way up through 8th grade. They are accurate, reliable, and efficient measures of oral and written language. And the things that we measure include these bottom strands here. So what we're talking about are going to be word recognition. This is phonological awareness. So blending, segmenting, identification of sounds, the first sounds, that letter, like in a word, sound manipulation, right? And then decoding. So that's your letter sound correspondences, phoneme blending of written words, so text, and then sight recognition. So the automatic recognition of words that we learn through exposure while decoding. So coding and encoding, right? So we have measures that look at all of this in our cubed assessment. And I'm just throwing this out there to let you know that they exist. They are here, right? The DDM, the dynamic decoding measures is what DDM stands for. These are measures that look at static word recognition proficiency and the ability to learn the skill of recognizing words, right? So we can look at that. There are a lot of assessments and a lot of, I would say, instructional tools like UFLI, UFLI, that are available out there that really look at these skills here. But what we know is that in looking at the assessments in the 4th grade US National Assessment of Educational Progress, so the 4th grade reading results, what we know is that there are about 1 in 3 students that that cannot demonstrate basic proficiency on these assessments in reading. So in other words, they're not passing. So there's basic, proficient, and above, and they're advanced. And holy cow, like the basic, they're not even passing at a basic bare minimum level of competency for 4th grade reading. Now, if we can take the dyslexia statistics and say about 20%, and that's a high, mid to high average or projection of how many students might have dyslexia. That's looking at word and like decoding skills, word recognition strands, issues there. If 20% of the 1 out of 3 have dyslexia, then the other 80% of the kids who are not passing that exam, it's not dyslexia. It's not these things. We're encountering students where teachers, if you're a specialist, which I totally forgot to ask, throw it in the chat if you're a speech and language pathologist or reading interventionist, anything besides a teacher, that would have been me. We're getting, as specialists, as researchers, we're getting referrals to students who kind of like hand it to you and saying, oh, he has a comprehension problem. Oh, she has a comprehension problem. Oh, they've, I don't know, they don't understand what they're reading. That would be great if they even said it that specifically, but most of the time it's comprehension problems. So I would just want to put this out there. What exactly about comprehension is the student struggling with? That's like saying, oh, they can't read. Yeah, all right. So when you're saying they can read, but they're just not understanding what they read, why? And we want to look at that. A lot of our assessments do not really look at, and hate to tell you, this. So the language comprehension strands, there's a bunch, and you need to measure all of them, not some of them, all of them, to know diagnostically what is the language comprehension issue. So in the cubed 3, the assessments that we offer, the narrative language measures, or NLM, they're a set of subtests, and they measure static oral and written language comprehension and production. So a lot of our standards in education say speaking, listening, and writing and reading, right? This is the speaking aspect. Are your assessments actually measuring speaking, or are you as teachers? Because I didn't even have a rubric. We need to be measuring speaking. So we're able to do that with this assessment. And then we're able to more closely identify or understand, based on these assessment results, where our learners are at, who needs intervention for oral and or written language comprehension and production, or maybe everybody does. So I will throw that out there. This is not a diagnostic in terms of a developmental language disorder assessment. This is our tier 1 or core curriculum actually teaching what should be taught, so that on assessments like this, which is a general outcome measure, it's not closely aligned with our curriculum, which is good. It's a true measure of a student's ability to read and demonstrate these language comprehension skills. So when we have individuals, right, who can read the words, but they can't, or this is what we're told, they're not demonstrating knowledge of what it is that they're reading. What's the big issue with this? And we know from Fay, there's a quote from their article in 1988 that says, language serves too many functions. This is a problem, that there's no way that we can actually teach all of these individual skills one at a time. We do not have enough hours in the day. And I mean, not even us, the student. We don't have access with them enough. If you taught explicit vocabulary, like one definition at all, at all times, in the span of, I think it was, I might be misquoting by like 100 here, but I think it was in the first grade year, you would have to teach 4,000 words just to get 1,000. Maybe it was like 1,000 words just to get 400. Either way, I think it was the other way around. I think it was like 4,000 words to 1,000 learned, for the trajectory to kind of close the gap between the learners that did have like really great, rich language nutrition in their early childhood years to when at school we're trying to close the gap. We don't have that time, right? We can't just teach vocab. There's a bunch of others, as you know, there's a bunch of other things that we should be working on that go into reading comprehension. So this is a problem, right? We need a way to teach broad-based language rules and to teach students how to modify those rules under appropriate conditions. And the reason being is that they don't have enough time for us to individually teach us one at a time for it to make a difference, right? And going back into those lifelong outcomes, this is a huge social justice issue. So Story Champs is going to provide you with tools to explicitly, systematically, and comprehensively teach oral and written language. Because once you identify a problem, right? And so if we assess, I'll provide a link to the Cubed in case you have not tried it out yet, you don't know what we're talking about. Provide a link at the end of this webinar so that you can go check it out. But once you identify the problem, the Story Champs intervention or program can provide you with tools to support the remediation of those problems, right? So it's not that there's a disability, it may be like every kid is missing these skills. They did not get explicit, systematic, and comprehensive instruction in their previous grade or grade levels before we've been working with them. So we need to have a solid understanding of what language is. As learners, it's the basis of how we communicate and what we need to read and write. And so again, that's where Story Champs is going to equip you with these tools. So what is Story Champs? It is a multi-tiered, meaning it's going to have large group, small group, and one-to-one lesson plans. Systematic, so a semi-manualized program. Explicit and sequential academic language instruction program. It was specifically designed for implementation within a multi-tiered system of language supports, meaning MTSS, or multi-tiered system of supports, for reading isn't good enough because people will focus just on word recognition. So we have now coined it multi-tiered system of language supports because language deserves to be front and center just as much as quote unquote reading, because everybody thinks of word reading skills. So we have designed it so that you get one kit and you get all of these different lessons in the different formats. We also carefully constructed the stories and illustrations so that, as you will see, we teach complex academic language like narrative discourse, advanced vocabulary, modifiers, causal and temporal ties, your subordinate clauses. And we're doing that rather than individually and taking up way too much time doing one thing at a time, which we also know is not effective or efficient. We do it through storytelling and retelling activities. Okay, so you can use Story Champs in mainstream classrooms, your general education classrooms. You can use it for tutoring. You can use it in school, in a clinic, for intervention with students or clients at risk for or having disabilities related to language and learning. If you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat. So anybody who is trained in Story Champs procedures can implement lessons in any format, right? So if you're a literacy specialist, reading coach, classroom teacher, instructional assistant, clinician, so speech pathologist, behavior analyst, yada, yada, yada. Parents, yeah, so I said instructional assistants, parents, undergraduate students, researchers, basically anybody who wants to use it can use it. You just need to be trained. We do offer training. It's not mandatory. It is highly encouraged, and we offer training virtually, which is online, asynchronous, which is you watch the recorded videos on your own, or live in person as well. To deliver lessons, you are provided with a set of child relatable narratives. They're stories that have themes that pretty much every child will or has experienced those themes, like not getting what you want. There's different variations of that within the story themes. And those come already prepared in the storybook. And now all of those stories are also leveled based on the degree to which they include complex language features, because we're not going to have a storybook provided to you where it's got too much vocabulary that's advanced or too many causal and temporal subordinate clauses when your learner is just being introduced to narrative intervention and you just want them to focus on the patterns and discourse. So yes, we have multiple levels. We call them A through J. But the most important aspect to deliver the lessons, right, you need the lesson plan, and that also comes with it. Now you'll see here a picture of it's on a projector, but if you have a smartboard, computer, laptop, whatever, you have access when you buy a Story Champs kit to the digital resources, which includes a digital format, and I'll show you a little bit of what that looks like later. Now, typical lesson for improving your early learners. When I say early learner, I'm thinking developmentally because I used to work with middle school adult learners with complex language needs, and this was appropriate for them. So when you hear me out, let's just talk about developmentally, they're emergent. But a typical lesson for improving the oral narrative's retell skills, because retelling is easier than telling your own story to generating your own. It basically follows the principles of effective instruction. All of our lessons do. This thing is so heavily researched, it's not even funny. So we've been busy doing research. Trina and Doug have been just slamming out those research articles. They work for universities full time as professors and getting grants to get funding for randomized control trials, et cetera, that we haven't been busy marketing and doing business and getting this into the hands of school districts. So if you are just now learning about it, that's because this is a research program first that then went to market after versus the other way around. So I could go on a tangent about like why that's good, but also why that's bad. It's because people are using things that don't work. And we only come to find out they don't work is because finally research is coming out. Anyway, so here's step one of most lessons, right? You always want to start with the adult presenting a model. Right? This is context. It's whole part whole. So the whole part of instruction is here's the context. I'm the adult. I present a series of illustrations. I read aloud a story, and I put icons down as I'm reading as they appear within the story. Now that's to illustrate key parts of the story. All right. And this is for large group, small group, or one-to-one. And we provide you a lesson plan that literally tells you this step. Okay. So you'd always have a lesson plan in front of you. Can't see it, lesson plan's over there with Trina. So there's Trina, one of the co-creators of Story Champs. In fact, Story Champs was her dissertation project. So step two, and this is going to be for a small group. Focus on this just to give you an idea of how this goes. So I told a story, I read it, I had illustrations, I put icons out as I'm reading the story so the students start to be like, oh, every time she reads the name, she puts down this icon. Oh, there's a problem or there's a feeling word and she put down an icon. Over multiple different stories that like not the same, they start to realize that there's a pattern in discourse structure. So the second step is called the team retell. And at this point, you have some students in front of you or learners, and you take those icons back and you divvy them up, right? And then with one at a time. Sometimes they may have two. You're going to have the students retell that same story, and you're going to help them because they're not going to be good. And this is an instructional program. This is not an assessment. So we're not taking discrete child data plus minus did the kid do it during our lessons. We're actually doing what we got into the job to do, which is teach. And that goes back to use the cubed narrative language measures for the assessment of whether or not Story Champs is working. So we're going to retell the entire story together. Everybody's going to contribute a part based on the little icon that they were given, and they get my help as the instructor. And then probably because that was a hot mess, we go ahead and I'm going to summarize that story so everybody hears it again and is complete and coherent. Also because they are just now learning how to listen to each other. At this point, then you've got the remainder of like step 3, 4, and 5. It depends on how many people are in your group, up to 4 in a small group, but everybody's going to take a turn to retell the story. All right, so we're going to systematically withdraw visual supports after every turn. And then to make sure that we increase student responding or keep the students active, if they're listening, it's not their turn, they play what's called story games. And so as they're listening to their friends tell a story, or their friend tell a story, they're going to play this game, and there's a set of procedures that are available in the lesson plan to do that. Now, the procedures themselves in the lesson plans are semi-scripted, right? So there's a little bit of flexibility, which is super nice, given that, you know, when researchers write something and say it works, they're normally like super manualized, strict procedures. And we're not about that, because in real life, things happen and there's a fire drill. So many times I've done recordings or visited classrooms to model Story Champs for people, and there's always a fire drill. Anyway, the removal of visual supports, though, is a standardized procedure. It's standardized, it's systematic, this works. So you can see here that over the course of each student, we're slowly fading out the reliance on the illustrations and the icons, right? And we get to the last student who still has our help, because they all have help throughout this. I'm not testing them. We don't want them to get anything wrong, so we don't want them to struggle. So if you're the student that gets 0 visuals in front of you and it's your turn to retell the story, mind you, you've heard it like 5 times at least by now, but you also still get my help so that you can independently retell the story without those things. This is imperative, right? But that is pretty much the entire lesson of a small group lesson, the basic procedures. Okay, so any questions that we have? All right, Christy, thank you. All right. We will throw up some trainings in case you guys are interested at the end. Put some links in the chat. All right, so background knowledge. I'm gonna go, let me just like really quickly remind you, dun, dun, dun. We're gonna go through this, the science of reading, how does Story Champs address all of these things? So with the remaining time today, and I'm gonna leave enough for questions, how are we addressing this in Story Champs? So close your eyes if you get dizzy. All right, first one, background knowledge. Background knowledge refers to the facts and concepts that you need as an emergent reader or early reader or a reader at all to make text to world connections. All right, and here in this picture, this is a great example of making the connection with Story Champs of stories and allowing students to bring their own experiences to the table. So if I am using a Story Champs lesson, and this is my story that I'm going over, at the very end, or even during, you're going to notice students are going to make connections with, oh, well, one time I had a candy bar and it melted, or I had chocolate in the car and it melted and my mom got so mad. They're going to want to talk to you about that. And that is wonderful. That is demonstrating that we have basically keyed up or fired up. This theme of this story is relevant to that child's personal experiences, and which is why we've written these stories with these themes, so that we are activating background knowledge. Now, that being said, some of you may not have my Australia friends. This one, if you have a Story Champs kit, you can tell me right now, and I already know, we refer to it as a chocolate candy bar. Seems kind of redundant. And so my Australian friends have given us feedback that it'd be great if we could modify those stories so it just says chocolate. Another thing with cafeteria, those don't exist in Australia. And so we are very, very, very close to making those storybook adaptations so that you can purchase those instead. Be on the lookout by the end of the year. So that in and of itself, they're modifiable. But let's say you don't have that exact same experience. Well, I don't want to only read stories to my students that I know that they've had those experiences. The themes and the problems that are experienced by the main characters. Here's one where this little boy wants to like move the fish tank and he picks it up, but then he spills water out of it. And then the water gets all over the floor and it's wet. And he's in his brother's bedroom and he's really worried. So he asks his brother for help and then they clean it up together, right? That may not have happened to any of the students that we know. They may not have had this experience. They may not have a brother. They may not have a fish. But the fact that you spilled something absolutely has happened. This could also be useful when we get to it in executive functioning and problem solving, that just knowing this story and the schema and like what a character did to solve a problem may be helpful in the future for some of our learners who, what if they ended up getting a pet and they were trying to move it and they spilled litter, the cat litter all over the floor, or the dog food everywhere because they were trying to move it. What if they were trying to move a plant in the house to a new location and they spilled it all over the floor? Like there's enough of a theme that's really applicable that students actually do remember the story champ stories. So what happens is we provide them with background knowledge for future experiences through story champ stories. So one, the stories themselves, the themes are very accessible, but even if they aren't truly 100% within the repertoire or the background of experiences of our learners, they potentially would be in the future. The chances of them having a similar experience in the future, if they haven't had one, is pretty high. Vocabulary. This strand is very important because embedded vocabulary interventions are way more effective than teaching vocabulary alone. Again, we don't have time to teach all these individual words and their definitions. We would run out of time and still not have enough time if that's all we did in a day. So embedded vocabulary intervention is an evidence-based practice. We use the context of stories that makes learning more efficient and effective. So what that means is that students are more likely to acquire and generalize definitional knowledge if words are taught in these natural contexts. And we're talking about general academic words, multiple meaning words, or what we call polysemous, Polyssemous. So think the word ground. Ground could be, I got grounded because I'm in trouble. I grounded the ball when I was playing baseball. My house is above ground. The parking garage is below ground, like all of these different ways you can use ground. So you want to expose students to that. And then domain specific words. Think of all the jargon in this presentation. So you can use story champs to address all of these things. Now, here's an example. In the story champs program, we have something called a quick start guide, and it basically is like a scope and sequence available for the grades preschool through grade 3. For my Australia friends, that's year 3. And so what we're looking at here, and these are all excerpts from each of those pages, but these are all of examples of vocabulary, the scope and a sequence of vocabulary instruction that goes across the grade levels. In this middle column are the lesson plans that come with story champs. Now, again, what we want to be doing when we're using story champs or in general is that we need to balance what we're teaching. So we don't want to teach just a bunch of words. We need systematic and focused instruction on tier 2 and tier 3, okay? Tier 1, these are rarely require instruction except if our learners are more impacted by language difficulties. Okay, so I think about my learners using AAC or assistive and augmentative communication devices, right? The PECs, picture exchange communication systems. Some of these AAC programs, I'm going to be working on tier 1 because I need their functional communication skills built up. But once they have a repertoire of enough noun verb combinations or nouns and verbs, we can work on 2-word combinations. And we can also start introducing or exposing them to tier 2 words, the general academic vocab, right? So this is going to be the highlight of Story Champ stories, particularly the Blitz stories. So Story Champs, this is from the lesson plan, the master lesson plan PDF that comes with the downloads with Story Champs. They facilitate the teaching of general academic words. Those are words that we use in school more frequently than non-academic settings. So they're not going to learn it. If they struggle with language learning already, they need explicit instruction. So we've got 4 lesson plans that go along with teaching vocabulary explicitly or teaching vocabulary inferencing, as I'll show you. And then we've got another 5th lesson plan here that goes with the domain-specific words. So what we know, learning complex academic vocab requires many repetitions. You need a lot of practice with words. You need a lot of practice with meanings in multiple contexts for extended periods of time. This right here is the result of research in which even an article we just published this year with 1st graders who are at risk for language and disabilities, we taught words explicitly during the intervention, right? So we're using this lesson plan and we're doing explicit vocabulary instruction. This is an example of the add-on. So I might have been using like the small group lesson plan here. Excuse me. And so I might have used that and then added this add-on to that lesson plan. Again, this isn't training. So if you want training on how to use this, you need to sign up for training. But so we taught them explicit vocabulary definitional knowledge, but it was pretty intense. It used a repeated acquisition design. So it's Spencer et al. 2023. If you're interested and want it, go ahead and throw your email in the chat or in the end of webinar survey. Tell me that you want it. Be like, send me all the research, and we will. But it wasn't until the students interacted and used the words and extension activities that they actually retain the meaning of words over time. And that's what we've found. It's not just our research, but others as well. So that leaves us to, well, we don't have all this time to teach every single word explicitly, and then make sure they practice using those words that we just taught. I think it's something like 90% of the words that we learn, even into adulthood, come through inferencing, or we learn them indirectly, right? So our learners that struggle with language learning, they need more direct instruction on how to use context clues to support inferential word learning. This is where we have lesson plans that go along with helping them to do this. So this is an example right here. This is called Blitz vocabulary words, and we are basically teaching students to listen for unusual words and then to use in these prepared stories that we have in the storybook, specifically that go with this lesson plan. For example, it would say, use any Blitz story to target gray bold words. Well, here is a Blitz story and I have gray bold words right here, right? I also can teach context clues, students how to use them, because we have 3 bold words in the black bold font, and those have context clues that are in italics. And our lesson plan would then also tell us how to teach students to listen for those context clues and then to infer the meaning of these new words. And we would go over it and we'd practice them. Okay. Here's the small group classic vocabulary instruction, right? And again, this is just like the add-ons. How do you use them? You add them to existing master lesson plans. And then this just goes to show you right here how to use word journals. Whoops, I went too fast. How to use word journals, right? To record words, definitions, synonyms, example sentences. These are the extension activities that I was talking about. So these come also with the kit. These are the Blitz word journals, and you can have them write these words talk about synonyms, write definitions, and then this is super important, is have them generate with your fading support, adult supports, example sentences. Okay, so that's vocabulary, and that was just in a nutshell. There's so much more. I only have like 20 minutes. So language structure. So the structure of language at the sentence level is called microstructure. All right, and you want to teach students patterns at the sentence level so that they can generalize those skills to new experiences when they're asked to listen to or read text. All right, we know that retelling is correlated with reading comprehension. So the more that we practice story retelling, the better the comprehension outcomes for on reading assessments are. So the reason being is that retelling in and of itself, we're going to be able to practice things like morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And the reason being with story champs is that we give you stories where you can trust that there are these things ready to be taught, and also lesson plans that go with it. How the heck are you supposed to teach these? So story champs addresses three main types of elaborated noun phrases. Those are targets that appear in these stories, as you can see right here. Here's one about Daniel's ruined writing. And this way, the students have multiple opportunities to hear these words. Now, we call them connection words. So the word because is a causal connection, and the word when would be an example of a temporal connection. So we would have our storybook in front of us. It's a little spiral bound book. It's not digital, so you have this in front of you, and you're either presenting digitally, like on the computer, smartboard, or interactive whiteboard, or you're using the actual paper illustrations and materials that come with the kit. But that spiral book, hold on to it. That one right there, right? You're reading it and you might be reading the story. Like the other day, Dana was working at his desk because his teacher told him to write an amazing story. When a boy marched by his desk, he unintentionally spilled water on Daniel's paper. So you would read it and you put out these icons, and then the lesson plan tells you, go back and reread the sentences that contain the target words and then put the icon out so that they can hear it. And when you read the word, you put out the icon, right? And you're calling their attention. And then what you do is through the retelling, remember, we're going to go through all those same steps where I told a story and then I introduced this and then we tell it together and then they all have individual retells. I'm making sure that they have multiple opportunities to practice, including those words. So here are all of the lesson plans across the different tiers, right? Tier 1, 2, and 3, or small group, large group, and 101. And here's an example of this would be for the temporal connections. So this is a level D story in which we would be working on after, before, when, while, as, until, all of those temporal connection words. We also work on noun verb modifiers, and those are the words that are going to modify a noun or a verb, right? So you're talking about adjectives and adverbs. Our stories come pre-planned, like already prepared with those things. Whether you're ready to target them or not, they're going to be embedded in there, but some story levels are specifically written so that they do focus on that. So here's an example right there. There you go. Here's an example right here of level E story in which we are strictly working on modifiers, and you can see everything here in the black bolded font that are noun verb modifiers. So we've got our adjectives, double adjectives, adverbs that appear before a noun. I don't think in this one right here, yeah, always come before. Yep. And then we have morphological awareness. And so this is going to be important. We need students to have the ability to analyze words in these parts, to listen to words and not just teach this through text, like reading. So it's good for us to have them listen to and identify these things. So morphemes, morphological awareness, right? So morphemes are the smallest units of meaning, or grammatical functions. And the easiest thing to start teaching is root words. So root words are morphemes because they have meaning. And then we add other morphemes to that root word, like prefixes and suffixes, right? And so there's really a lot of strong evidence that if you integrate morphological awareness into language intervention, it then increases reading comprehension outcomes. So even if it's an oral language intervention like Story Champs, you're going to improve reading comprehension outcomes when you're doing things like this. So you can use Story Champs lessons for additional morphological awareness instruction. In this one story or passage, like right here on the bottom right, about Maya's messy room, there's actually several words that might give students who have language difficulties some challenge because they're morphologically complex, right? Neighborhood, you have to talk about that. The compound words, you have to talk about, let's say, closest. Let's talk about close, and then it's closer, and then it's the closest, right? And you can talk about the different suffixes and meanings. You could also, after you're done reading the story and you go through the retells, take some extra time and say, okay, now I want to read the story again to you, and I want you to listen for the suffix li, all right, ly, and I'm going to write that out if I had students in front of me. So I want you to count, and I'm going to give you a pencil and paper. How many times do you hear li when I'm reading the story? All right, so I'm going to read it one more time, and then we're going to talk about it and see who counted the right amount. So even just doing that with some extra time that you have when you're doing your Story Champs story is wonderful. All right. Verbal reasoning. This one we assess in the cubed, and this goes a little bit further than the explicit instruction that we have in the current Story Champs kit. It's embedded and it's kind of like naturalistic, but I'm going to give you some ideas for what you should be doing in case you're not. Because verbal reasoning is all about students' understanding of figurative language, right? Which is kind of easy to teach. There's lots of activities available for that. But really, it's knowing how to use text-to-text connections and text-to-self connections to make inferences about a text. Making inferences about what we read, or like what's being read to us, or actually just in different surroundings, can be critical life or death thing, right? It's a standard-based skill, but it's also important for reading comprehension. Students who have higher levels of inferencing always do better and have higher scores on reading comprehension. So one area of academic language is this inference making area that's often overlooked because it just, again, it needs, a lot of folks don't know how to do it, all right? So think of it this way. If I am talking through a Story Champ story and I've got this narrative discourse and there's always a pattern, I might be doing a double episode story, a level J story, which is called an advanced story structure. I might want to have students think about what, like before I read the story, I might give them the problem and be like, okay, I want you to think about what the character might do to solve their problem. And then I'm going to read it, and then we can talk about whether or not that was the same idea that you had and did it work or not. Okay, so talking about that, and then at the end discussing it again. Trina describes inferencing, and I like this, as fancy guessing, right? So especially when you have some, but like not all parts or pieces of a puzzle, like when there's some missing, but you generally get the idea of what was supposed to be there if you had all the pieces. So this is when students, if they can get to about 80% understanding of what's written or what was just said, they can guess on the rest and they'll be pretty close. But if they know less than 80%, that cognitive load is way too high. Kids won't even try to make inferences. It's like, it'd be a waste of our time. So it's important that we want to give them other things, or we want to work on other things to build up until the point where we can work on inferencing alone. So discourse structure, right? So you're going to need to be able to retell the basic parts of a story in sequence, and then you need inferencing to recognize how the actual events are causally and temporally related, right? Vocabulary. Inferencing, you need inferencing to be able to figure out the meaning of words from context. We just looked at that in the previous slide. We have lesson plans for that. Complex sentences. There are clues like the word because that have power over inferencing. If students learn that the word because, which goes back into sentence complexity and microstructure, if they look for the word because, that most likely is going to link two different events and tell you why one thing happened because of another thing. just that one word. So teaching them the power of when, that tells you when something happened to the story. So when you go to answer these WH questions in your passages for reading comprehension assessments, and it asks you a WH question like when, you can look for after, before, while, as, until. If it asks you, but why did something happen? Go look for because, right? And then you can kind of piecemeal those. Story chimps is great for then teaching those preliminary skills. Then we have morphological awareness, and that's just understanding the root words and unfamiliar. But in general, I'm just going to give you some tips that you can support students searching for clues in listening to these story chimp stories and to make text-to-text connections. Because one, you want to ask them to think about their own examples, how that connects with what they just listened to, how that connects to what they've been reading outside of the story champs lessons or what they've read in the past. Stop them and have them answer questions like, well, why and why not, right? Ask students, why do you know that? That's like the best question that you can ask them. Have them use information from the story to back up their responses, okay? And then prediction is a great inferential task. Asking, what do you think will happen next? What if? Those tend to be overused versus how do you know? So I would encourage you to start asking, well, tell me why you think that, or how do you know? All right, and then we get to literacy knowledge, and that involves understanding individual discourse elements and patterns that appear. And so when we think about this, you really can't answer all of these WH questions unless you have knowledge of the elements that go into stories that are going to answer all of these questions, right? So when I was talking earlier about story champs and like the digital presentation, this is an example of a level A story or a basic story structure, and you have the storybook in front of you. You can't use this without it. And you've got all of these illustrations that are available to you at different levels. So you would pick them, that one that matches. So remember, Daniel's ruined writing. You'd read the story, and as you're reading and you come across these elements, you'd put these out. What this does across all of those different stories at the same level that you just saw on the previous screen, what this does is give them a sense that there's a pattern that occurs, and students start to make predictions or look for or listen, actively listen for information. So if we were to omit this part of the story, they would be confused and they would be like, huh, that's weird. Makes them really work on that. Okay. We also have lessons, but you need to supply your own expository or informational content. More information on that within the lesson plans themselves for information or expository discourse, right? So here's an example of the supplies or materials that we provide, which is icons and these pattern blocks. And you can get resources like from coreknowledge.org. And last but not least, the writing strands and cube 3. So the writing rope, we don't talk about enough. We will. These kids keep failing. So Story Champs has amazing writing lesson plans. That is one of my favorite areas of research. Here you can get, this is the first article that came out that showed a causal or like direct relationship between oral storytelling and writing outcomes. And then I replicated that study with Trina and my friend Iva, and we did that with kindergarten because everybody's like, oh, it's not going to work. Too young. No, they're not. Their handwriting is awful and it makes it really hard for research. And you'll see. So like these are open access. You can download those for free. And you'll see some writing samples of like the most legible ones. But gosh, that was fun. So narrative language, storytelling is a bridge between oral and written language. It's the easiest way to get students to learn how to write is by teaching them all of the aspects of language that go into written language. We have lesson plans, as you can see here, across multiple grade levels for writing. There's your scope and sequence. Here's examples, like there's one right there of a student actually generalizing. These icons were not there. I put them there for the sake of this training, but the student ended up making their own icons at the top of their paper so they would remember. This is first or kindergarten or first grade. I feel like it's first. And in that right there, I mean, like, it's just beautiful. So that tells you that this schema sticks with them and they really like it. Here's an example of what the teacher was writing to then teach story copying or beginning writing. And then students would transcribe that to the rough draft that we provide them with. We're also big into writers' workshops, but also self-regulated, all of these different evidence-based gold standard practices. Basically, if it's systematic and it's research-based and it shows it works, but one of those things is going back and proofreading your own writing or doing peer tutoring. And so we provide these writing checks as well. They can be used with Story Champs stories or Story Champs lessons or not. You can use them on your own. They're great rubrics. And then finally, we've got also information or expository writing lesson plans. So that leaves us with a few minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. I'd be more than happy to answer. Christy, do you have anything that you want me to answer?
Would you like to answer the one that just came in? The could you work on writing at the same time as retail?
Yes. Okay. I will answer that. Sarah, yes, please, 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 please work on writing at the same time as retail. Do not wait for one to be more established than the other. The story copying is a great lesson plan to work on in Story Champs. And you could also like interchange so you don't get too bored of delivering one lesson plan for too long. Maybe like every fifth session you do a writing one. Completely up to you. But I love writing and I am so glad that you asked that question because it should be worked on. Rather than wait till kids have proficiency in handwriting, please don't wait to teach them what to write. By focusing on handwriting, like how to write, it's almost like saying, hey, we're going to only work on decoding skills until they can read words, and then we'll teach them how to comprehend what it is they read. It's the exact same thing, and it's a horrible, horrible approach that our schools are doing. So, Christine asked, does the kit come with lesson plans areas you addressed? Are the kits? So, Christine, you get a kit, you get access to everything. So our lesson plans, and I will show you right quick, do not have grade levels on them for the reason being that you might be using this with an 8th grader, right? Or you might be using this actually with, let's say, kindergarten or 1st grade, and that might be on par. If you're curious about the scope and sequence for grade level or tier 1 or core curriculum, or even tier 2, then that's going to come in the quick start guides. And so you just go pick those lesson plans. And there is a scope and sequence that's much more beautiful than this. I cut out these vocabulary parts from each of them, like 1 page. So you get for like the whole thing, in case you switch grades, that's also nice because I used to get moved. You have everything you need when you buy it forever. How long does a kit take to be shipped to Australia? Does anybody from Australia know the answer? So, Patricia, we ship things out of our warehouse in Texas within like 3 business days. There's only about 5 of us. One of the owners and his wife are the ones that ship. And then on weekends, if there's a bunch of orders, their son comes and helps. So we get them out right away. So it's most up to the shipping, but maybe someone else knows. Is it recommended that this is used in both the whole group, tier 1 instruction, and in small groups? In Utopia, this absolutely is used as core curriculum because I have yet to find a good program that addresses all of these strands here, not these ones. Most schools are doing really great with this now, with the whole push of science reading, but unfortunately, people think science of reading means only that. And then to the detriment of our kids are still going to fail the reading assessments because most of them who are failing have language comprehension, not decoding issues. So it's not dyslexia. Some of them, it is 20%, but the other 80% that are failing is this. So it would be really great if I started seeing this in the primary grades. We built or designed Story Champs for that reason, like to be tier 1. That's why we give whole group lessons and small group and one-on-one. But I would say majority of users right now are mostly interventionists and speech pathologists who are using it as an intervention. we do have tons of publications though showing that it works as a grade level tier 1 intervention or instructional program. Crystal, thank you. You got yours. You're in Australia. You got yours in 2 weeks. Perfect. I don't know if Kathy's still on. Welcome, Teacher's Aid, SSO. Glad you're here. I used to be an aide. Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna fast forward to, and I'm like, why is so many people still on here? That's why. So if you're curious about Cubed, the assessment itself, you wanna try the free paper pencil, you've got that here. Then we've got, just make sure that you're using the most recent edition, please, because it's awesome. But you can go ahead and scan that. And then here is the end of certificate. Christine, in this survey, when you do this, ask me for our research. Christy, I don't know. I don't know if we can attach the, thank you, Christy. Christine, we have way more than What Works Clearinghouse. They have not been updated since 2017, maybe like a tiny bit. And for some reason, the US government has not funded more stuff. So we just keep putting out our more research and updating it on our own. And we've been included in like systematic reviews and meta-analyses by other people. So it's not like our research. All right, so in the chat, everybody, you'll see Christy just put a link to our 2024 research synthesis that has infographics. We made beautiful infographics for all the research articles because who has time to read all of those? I don't. So, I mean, technically I do now, it's my job, but when it wasn't, I didn't. And then also they're way prettier and easier to understand. We also provide links to download the articles for free as much as possible, so that there's no paywall. Never pay for an article. Always email the authors. They will be more than happy to send you a copy. We also put links to download the Cube 3 in the chat. And if you're interested in purchasing Story Champs, I'm gonna go ahead. If you do the survey, I put a coupon code in case you are interested in purchasing Story Champs. So fill that out. You'll get an email. And then it'll have a coupon code that will not expire. All right, thank you all so much. Patricia, send us a message, an email up here so that we can get you more information. All right, it is the end of the webinar. Out of respect for your time and all of our families' times and our clients or students, if you're in Australia, you got to go do your normal job. Thank you for joining me. Christy, thank you for helping me. I will see you all again. We will be back next month for another free webinar. I believe it will be on artificial intelligence and language sampling. So stay tuned. Sign up the same way you signed up for this one. And I will send out a link to this recording in a couple days. All right, thanks all.